Cool. Wicked. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have Kim here with us for our Pride Month webinar. So I'm just going to do a little quick intro of like who I am and like what I do at Happiness Index, and then I'm going to pass over to Kim to introduce themselves as well. So obviously I'm Kashi. I am the Community and Events Executive. So I work in the marketing department, and I sort of work to help manage and sort of help manage and look after our community, and also to help curate and put on events for you guys. So I'm going to pass over to Kim if you'd like to introduce yourself and what you do.
For one thing, I spend 5 minutes looking for the mute button. I'm Kim. I am non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. In my day job, I am a technical consultant for a managing consultancy called Credera. So I do a lot of work in helping do big corporate data estate transformations. But around that, I am also the diversity lead at Credera, and I'm a director at Trans in the City. And also, just for fun, I volunteer for diversity role models, and then the gender inclusion lead at Pride in Surrey.
Wicked. Wow. So you're a really busy person. Very lucky to have caught you.
Apparently, at some point, every time the BBC did another transphobic article, I started working with another charity or not-for-profit. So that happened.
Oh, gosh. Oh, I mean, silver linings. But yeah, so basically what we're going to do today is just be able to open up the conversation about, I think, like what the terms sort of gender non-conforming and non-binary means. I think a lot of people get quite confused with a lot of terminology, and I think that's where, you know, we begin is with the knowledge part. So should we talk through a little bit about like terminology and like what I guess what being non-binary means to you?
Sure. So I guess then to kind of pull on the specific elements where you said sort of you've mentioned. So firstly, I'm going to say what I'm going to say is my view on it. Other people have different views. I can't speak for everyone, but I can speak for kind of my understandings, both of non-binary as it relates to me and as terminology as we use it.
Absolutely.
One part of this is that non-binary is kind of commonly thought of to be underneath the umbrella of what we call trans. Not all non-binary people will consider themselves to be trans, and that's their own kind of personal understanding of their identity. I do consider myself trans. Alongside that, we have the other term that you threw out, is kind of gender non-conforming. Some people will put gender non-conforming always under the trans umbrella. I disagree with that personally. I think that you can be cisgender and gender non-conforming, and that's the beauty of it, is that so gender non-conforming is basically you in some way don't hold to the stereotypical act, presentation, representation of your sex assigned at birth, or of your presented gender, in fairness, because you can have gender non-conforming trans people. So I'm going to rephrase that too. You don't sort of present or act in line with your gender.
Yeah.
But as far as I'm concerned, if you are gender non-conforming, but you identify with you have the match between gender and sex assigned at birth, then you are cisgender gender non-conforming, and that's fine. That's brilliant. It's amazing that people can do that. Sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there. Anyway,
that's okay.
Coming down specifically down to non-binary, non-binary identities effectively are any identity that doesn't sort of match with 100% male or 100% female 100% of the time. A lot of people don't like the term non-binary for various reasons. For one thing, it sets up a bit of a weird dichotomy between binary identities and non-binary identities. And what does it mean if I say, well, yes, you are a binary person? It's a bit strange.
Of course, yeah.
So there's a whole load of other terms that people will use as kind of umbrella terms. Genderqueer is one that sort of waxes and wanes in popularity, and it's one that I probably prefer myself, but it's much less recognized. So non-binary is great as an umbrella term in itself to kind of collect together all of these identities.
For sure. I think that's like one really important thing to like emphasize, is that, you know, gender is such a spectrum and it's such a sliding scale. And I think when we view things just within that kind of binary and then non-binary thing, it kind of boxes people in like even more, despite it trying to be like trying to remove the boxes, but it kind of almost puts more boxes in.
Yeah, for sure.
If that makes any sense.
It definitely does, yeah. And it's where you get a lot of the rub and pushback actually when you set up that binary non-binary dichotomy, which is kind of where this gender non-conforming comes in, where people you'll see an argument which is often made in bad faith, but has a grain of reasonableness to it, which is, oh well, if we're setting up this binary non-binary dichotomy and you're a woman who identifies as a woman but doesn't hold to the sort of stereotypical female presentation. So for example, if we're talking about a butch lesbian, so we're talking about a gender non-conforming woman, but we're also saying that binary womanhood means identifying with your gender fully and everything, then we get quite a lot of pushback there on actually, does this make any sense as a split to make?
Absolutely. So yeah, obviously our audience here today are sort of primarily people who are working within HR, internal comms, DE&I and that kind of thing. So I guess what we'd like to do is sort of just talk through some advice of what you might have found was useful, obviously just speaking from your experience, in terms of what we can be doing to make sure that the workplace is a safe space for our colleagues who are non-binary, trans, gender non-conforming, you know, whether it's, you know, whether they are transitioning in the workplace or just sort of creating a safe and comfortable environment. Like what could we be doing to foster that?
Yeah, of course. So I guess a bit of sort of my personal story here, it's relevant to this element. I came straight out of academia because I did a PhD into the job that I have now. When I applied for this job, I had pretty much I had worked out that I was trans, I'd worked out that I was non-binary. I hadn't worked out what I wanted to do about that.
Yeah.
And I had been openly gay for a few years beforehand anyway. So when I had my initial interview, I did the company has a yearly Christmas do where you're allowed to bring a partner, and so I explicitly asked in my initial interview, so for these kind of events, is it okay to bring a same-sex partner, like to kind of test the waters that they would be fine with me being gay, and that was all fine. But at that point didn't mention anything about gender identity because I hadn't quite settled out on what that meant for me yet.
Yeah.
But what it means is that I then had the experience of having to kind of work out what I was going to do about coming out at work, and doing so, it turns out, entirely in a vacuum, because as with many companies, there was no kind of transition policy, there was no precedent, there hadn't been another trans person in the company, or there was no visible trans person in the company. So working out what I wanted to do in terms of coming out and what that was going to mean and what would then need to happen was something that I was having to do kind of entirely in isolation in my own head, without knowing if there would even be any support in the company. So I guess one of the first things that you can do and that I would recommend doing, because it's free to do basically, is to make sure that you have some kind of policy statement about, hey, if you're going to come out and transition at work, like here are things that we think you need to think of. Here are things that we can do. And also kind of including a transition policy, like here, not just advice for the person who is coming out as trans, but also for managers and colleagues, like a whole section on like, hey, if one of your sort of if one of the people who reports to you comes to you and says, look, I'm trans, I want to come out at work, what do I do? This is how you should handle it. And it's really important in this policy to kind of underscore that you appreciate that everyone's transition is different. There is no right or wrong way to do it. And so everything should be led by the trans person. So it's I guess a descriptive more than a prescriptive policy. But just having that policy there shows that you've given some thought to it, and that you're prepared for it, which can be hugely reassuring for a trans person who's going through what's often quite a rocky and stressful period anyway.
Definitely, yeah. I think that's some really good advice there. I think it's always good to have you know, policies like that in place already, because, you know, then it's almost like a reassurance to the person in the company that can be like, right, okay, this is a safe place for me to do so because they've actually thought about this. Which
and there are some great resources available for helping to write those policies. I think Gendered Intelligence is happy to provide a skeleton policy if you email them and ask for it. So it's free, but they just like to know who's got it. And if you're a Stonewall Diversity Champion, so that you have access to the Stonewall resources, they have a load of guidance as well. So it's not even something that you kind of need to reinvent the wheel on. There's a lot of guidelines there.
Amazing. Right, folks, let's be taking notes. That is, wicked. So yeah, I mean, so we talked about like internally when, or like having the preparation of a policy in case someone, you know, having it in prep if someone does want to transition at work. In terms of like recruitment, like from a recruitment perspective, so I'm sort of thinking of like the employment from the whole process. So from a recruitment perspective, like how could we be making sure that we're being as inclusive as possible in terms of the way that we put jobs out and we interview and create that kind of environment?
So recruitment for making sure that you're sort of appealing to trans people and to LGBT people more generally, it's the same kind of things as you would do for improving any element of diversity. Lots of it obviously overlaps with what you need to look at in recruitment for trying to improve number of sort of female applicants you get, which is things like checking the language of your adverts, making sure that not only that the language is neutral, but also I think there's a lot of research available about the kinds of things you can say and the ways that you can structure adverts and how that may put off groups or appeal or make groups feel included. I think one of the ones you see for women is like if you list 14 points of things that you require, generally applicants, a lot of the research is on women, but a lot of this research actually applies to kind of anyone from a minority group of any kind. So if you list out 14 points, a lot of people from minority groups will feel they need to hit all 14. And so if that's not actually what you need, then maybe don't list those 14 points. Like make it really clear that you want applicants who don't necessarily cross all those things off. So a lot of it is just the general kind of inclusiveness that you would do to try and improve your response to ads anyway. Specifically, things that really help, because I don't have the numbers to hand, but the recent sort of Stonewall LGBT at Work survey, the British government LGBT at Work survey before that, they all show that a lot of trans people experience discrimination in the workplace. So anything that you can do in that initial job advert to say this is a safe workspace for trans people so that they don't have to go and do that research themselves. I like the first thing that I do when I'm looking at a job advert or any kind of recruitment advert, or anytime that I'm going to do an interview like this where I'm talking to people that I don't necessarily know, is I Google their name or I Google the company and transgender to try and find out what kind of environment I'm going to be in. So if you can put that up in the job ad at the start and go, it sounds silly, but kind of having a sentence in there going, we welcome application, we welcome transgender applicants, you know, we would fit something like that. It shows that it sets up that expectation up front that actually you are working to be inclusive. And so it's somewhere that they can be safe to apply and not feel like turning up to an interview and potentially not being visibly cis or not passing as cisgender won't be held against them.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's the big things. Then more complicated things, obviously, if you really want to go deeper into this, is and again, this is relevant for lots of minority groups, not just trans people, is a lot of trans people in particular will come from adverse histories of some kind. So they may not have been able to, if they had severe dysphoria through education, they may not have been able to attain high educational qualifications. They may have had poor mental health. They may have periods of unemployment. If you want to go really deep into how you can improve sort of your ability to recruit transgender people, looking at actually your whole kind of recruitment pipeline and the kind of things that you consider when assessing job adverts and seeing how you can make that more inclusive of people from different backgrounds is a huge step, but that's much more involved and much more complicated than putting a sentence in your job ad.
No, definitely. I think I completely understand that, like in terms of looking at job ads previously where I've looked at things and it's been like, oh, you need to have a like degree from this in this like thing, and I'm like, oh god, that's absolutely not something that I've done, and I've just completely passed it, despite it being something that I know I could have done, which is always a bit of a shame. But oh well, I'm here, THI for the win. But yeah, no, okay, wicked. That's some wicked advice. I just want to touch on, because this would be relevant to like both recruitment and I guess throughout the entire process of being employed anywhere, in terms of like whether it's HR, like data collection and stuff like that. But pronouns, I think that's quite a topic that a lot of people talk about, and I think a lot of people shy away from a lot of the time. Bottom line is we all use pronouns. We all have them. They exist for everyone. It's just a question of, I think, you know, not making assumptions as to what pronouns someone uses. So I guess what kind of what would you say is the best way to go about it, like in terms of when you're first meeting someone or when you're recruiting, or also when it comes to like HR, like data storing, what way could we go about it in terms of asking about pronouns, storing that kind of information?
Yeah. So first, I'm just going to apologise. There's a flock of starlings that are intermittently descending on the garden, who I think you might be getting in the background a little bit. But they seem to have just moved on again now, but they'll be back.
Lovely ambient background noise.
So yeah, pronouns is a hot topic in a lot of ways. As someone who uses they them pronouns, I will always give mine whenever there's an opportunity. You can see I've got them on my screen name here. I've got them in my signature. I don't expect people to guess them. And for a lot of people, their pronouns will seem obvious when they're looked at, and that's where we get these sort of defaults. And for some people, their pronouns will be completely different to what you expect, potentially because they are trans and they're transitioning, and they're maybe not at the state that they want to be at yet, where they sort of pass as cisgender. But also in an era of increasingly digital communication, if someone sends you an email and signs off Chris, what pronouns do they use? You know, are they male or female? It's not just a thing that's relevant for trans people.
Absolutely.
So a lot of people these days are saying that having a kind of giving rather than a requesting pronouns culture is better.
Mm-hmm.
This is partly because there are people out there who potentially are trans and not out yet, or who potentially are questioning, and might find it quite difficult to know which pronouns to give. Like if I was a closeted trans man who wanted to use he, him pronouns, but I was still presenting as female and hadn't come out,
Mm-hmm.
then you asking me for my pronouns forces me into a position of having to go, oh, do I say she, her because I'm not out yet and thus misgender myself? Or do I come out to you at this point when I don't necessarily know if you're a safe person to come out to? So yeah, the general sort of consensus is actually if you can be in a position that you give pronouns. So I meet you and I say, my name's Kim, I use they, them pronouns. That opens the door for you to kind of respond and give me yours if you want to.
Yeah.
But it doesn't force the issue. So you then at least get to make that kind of decision on whether you want to kind of respond in that way. And I mean, that means giving the option to give pronouns is really valuable. So having email signatures is a really common one, things like Zoom usernames where you can just put them on. Or also if you're collecting kind of, if you have forms that you're collecting information from applicants and candidates, having pronouns on there, but as an optional field.
Yeah.
Again, the whole ethos is don't make it mandatory, but allow people the opportunity.
Definitely. I think that sometimes also comes down with the like when people are collecting data, like looking at the gender section, and quite often it's not very inclusive at all, and also quite often not optional.
Yeah.
Which is,
I mean, as an audience of HR professionals, you will be aware to an extent we're tied on gender fields on things, because anything that connects to payroll has to connect to what the government stores, and currently the government stores male or female. But yeah, so it's a really good point that there's a constraint there, but it means that maybe we need to look at what we can do around that constraint. So okay, you need to hold this information on every employee because you require it to do payroll. But can you separate that information from employee facing systems? So could you have an employee facing system that allows more flexibility and allows people to precise their gender in a more kind of in a broader way, or not put it at all? And if so, how can you kind of approach that, and how can you protect that payroll data so that no one has access to it who doesn't need to? So if you have a trans woman at your company who simply hasn't done a gender recognition certificate, for example, or hasn't done the necessary process with HMRC to change the gender on record there, because realistically, it's not a thing that has a huge impact on your day-to-day life. Maybe she's not thought about it. You don't want to out her to the whole company by using that marker that you have on her payroll because you need it for HMRC, and thus putting male on everything else in the company for her. So how can you divide those systems to get around that constraint?
No, absolutely. I think, yeah, what I'm taking away from a lot of this is bottom line is all about ensuring that it is completely led by the person, by the trans person or the non-binary person, and we're taking our cues from them, because at the end of the day, like you said, the experience is going to be different for each person. Everyone's going to have different stages of where they're at, and like you said, not everyone is out in different places. I think that's one thing that I've learned personally in terms of pronouns, especially, is like volunteering is the best way, and that some people use different pronouns in different situations, and it's just being mindful of that. Typically when, if I volunteer my pronouns or I ask about someone else's pronouns, I'm asking sort of what environment would you like me to use those in, and I think that's quite important to keep in mind. Like you said, not everyone's out at work or out in different parts of their life, so just keeping that information.
And relevantly, just on that, I remember the other thing I was going to say about pronouns is, of course, don't just do it if you think there's a trans person in the room. Like, you're not going to have the read on everyone who is trans necessarily, and you also don't want to change your behavior to kind of single out, like, hey, look, there's a trans person in this meeting, so we're going to sort of be a little bit performative around them. Make it part of your standard interactions and the way you approach all of the sort of conversations and all of your communication channels.
Absolutely. I think that's like you said, it's a really important topic that affects everyone, not just trans people, in terms of pronouns and gender identity and those kinds of assumptions. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not something that is exclusive to trans people. It is important that we all do it, because we all use pronouns. And that is wicked good advice there. So I just wanted to touch back on the thing that you said earlier about offering support and like within the policies of the company, and especially because a lot of trans people might come back from backgrounds that are a little bit more difficult, or have like mental health issues and stuff because of that. Would it be beneficial in terms of benefits and policies, for companies to have maybe like additional support in terms of like mental health support, that kind of thing? Like, what kind of things can we be putting in place for that? Because obviously I think mental health is a topic that is massive anyway, across everyone. So what could we be doing?
I mean, I think this does really underscore underscore the fact that most of the things that you can do to improve sort of trans inclusivity in the company actually improve accessibility and inclusivity for kind of everyone, or for at the very least a very wide range of people, often who are from more sort of non-traditional backgrounds, if you want.
Definitely.
So things like mental health support, if you can have an employee assistance scheme, if you offer private health insurance, making sure that includes mental health support, that obviously benefits huge numbers of people. It does benefit trans people, but it benefits everyone really at the moment. I don't know if you know about sort of mental health first aiders. That's a scheme that we've started training people. So we've got people who are able to just help to lend that support internally. So really having multiple different avenues where people can seek help. Some of those, like mental health first aiders, can be internal, but actually having sort of external programs like employee assistance programs that people can go to, which will then potentially remain a bit more confidential from the company. So they might feel, people may feel a little uncertain talking to a colleague about their mental health because they may worry that it'll get back to HR, that will get back to their appraisers, that it'll end up featuring in their performance analysis. But if they can go to an external company like an employee assistance program, they may have a bit more confidence. So, I mean, how you can make that better for transgender people is to kind of do the research and ask the questions when you are kind of enrolling in these programs and go, hey, do you have anyone who's specifically trained in LGBT provision? And just finding out if they offer those kind of options, if that's something they've considered.
For sure. I think the mental health first aider thing is so, like, it's such a good training resource and something that I think every company should have, because it's so valuable. And I think, like you said, it can also be, in my opinion, like less intimidating to speak to someone like who's like maybe a colleague that is on your level rather than sometimes someone who's in like a management position, because it can be intimidating, especially if you feel like, you know, oh, I'm struggling with my mental health, or I'm struggling with this, and it might, you know, get put down in your notes or something, or it might go back to your appraisal. So having those kind of on the ground people that can be there as support is really important. You know, offering that kind of support at every level is so vital. And I think, like you said, it is really important to have people who are trained in all sorts of different things. Like, you know, mental health first aid is fantastic, but also, you know, the issues that different groups will face will be wildly different. So having someone who's trained specifically as well in LGBTQ plus like issues and mental health issues would be fantastic. So that's definitely one to consider. So yeah, in terms of sorry. Yeah, so in terms of HR stuff, God, you can tell I'm not we talk a lot about like employee resource groups. What sort of role would you say that they would have in like have to play in terms of supporting people and the HR team, like especially within this kind of topic?
So employee resource groups are great. Obviously, a lot of firms these days have an LGBT network. So the company, I actually used to run the LGBT network at Credera. I sort of founded it, and I've now kind of handed that over to take over the sort of diversity lead in general. Obviously, one of the things that we've been working on a lot is, I mean, we're a company that is about 300 people, but we've grown substantially. We were about 60 people when I joined 4 years ago. So as we're kind of forming these ERGs, a lot of the information that we can find about ERGs is kind of predicated on a 10,000 person global organization. So what you can actually do with them is obviously slightly dependent on size. So a lot of the advice that you get is, if we're talking specifically about LGBT groups, is make sure that you have a kind of formalized structure within your ERG to make sure that interests of different kind of minority voices that are often overlooked are represented. So have a trans rep or a trans group. This is whether you can do that or the degree to which you can do that is obviously dependent on how many people are in the ERG, because I mean at Credera there's probably about 10 of us, or there was probably about 10 of us when I last looked. Which makes it a bit hard to go, okay, so we'll have like a trans rep, we'll have a bi rep, we'll have a et cetera, and suddenly the whole group is in the board. So, but you can, if you are in a smaller context like that, you can still have a terms of reference for your ERG, and you can still have within that terms of reference provisions for how you will make sure that you are considering these sort of minority within a minority demographics. Even if there aren't enough of you to have reps, but also even if you don't necessarily have a trans person in your organization yet, you'd still want to kind of put into the terms of reference. This is what we were saying about the policy and having the policy in place in advance. Have something in your terms of reference to ensure that you do actually consider trans perspectives, even if you don't have a trans person there, to ensure that you are doing things that will hopefully make the environment more welcoming for a trans person to get involved at a later point. Definitely.
I guess that kind of like links back to the point of like making the space comfortable in prep. It's got to be sort of like a proactive, not like a reactive kind of thing. And that's kind of the same for any minority group, especially when it comes to diversity. It's all about proactive, not reactive, because I think that's kind of where you kind of toe the line between like making change and being performative. And yeah, like you said, that is very important to consider. I think that's kind of a point that's often missed, I think, is how important that kind of representation can be. Because say, for example, for me, I would never go somewhere really if I thought I was going to be the only brown person in the room, because I'd be like, right, that's not a space for me, you know. So I get it's kind of the same, not the same, but like a similar situation of like making sure that the space there is representation for each person, which is very important. So I remember you sort of talked a bit about the Stonewall report, and the research that they did on what kind of issues that a lot of trans and non-binary people face within the workplace as well. And I've actually got a couple of stats here. Look at me, all prepared. And so one of the things that I saw in this report that was gross, but is that almost a third of non-binary people, so 31%, and 1 in 5 trans people, which was 18% of this group, don't feel able to wear work attire representing their gender expression, which is awful. How could we be facilitating this within the workplace? Because I think a lot of especially a lot of like corporate, like office-based companies tend to have like a bit of a dress code. How can we be being more flexible with that?
I mean, the bottom line is that what you really want to do is make sure that your dress code is gender neutral. And so the company that I work for doesn't have is just sort of like business dress code. It doesn't have a particularly refined dress code. So I've not had to look at this in depth, and I'm not entirely certain where the law matches up to common practice. So I know, for example, that you can't mandate women all have to wear heels, but I don't know much of the granularity beyond that. But effectively, you want to make sure that your dress code is gender neutral. So ideally, you do want to give people the option to wear skirts, but you do want it to be both men and women can wear skirts if they really want to. So don't set up the two different standards. If you have uniforms as well, then trying to kind of avoid making the assumption about what uniform people want and allow them the options of choosing the style that they want. So if you have different shirts versus blouses, things like that, for example. But broadly, yeah, making sure that any rules you have are sort of expansive and sort of inclusive, rather than setting up these different standards and these different boxes that people have to go into.
Definitely.
And then kind of education internally. If you're a company that works internally, education internally about how people just sort of some things like unconscious bias training, things like just stereotypes training, things like that, to try and make it clear to people that actually if someone comes in wearing something that they don't expect, then that is, you know, you won't tolerate someone bullying someone or harassing someone based on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is really good advice. I think that is definitely something we need to consider. I think a lot of places aren't very size inclusive as well, and I've noticed quite a few of my friends that use binders found that with different like sizes of tops and stuff, there wasn't much leeway at work, and so ensuring
binders was exactly an example I was about to give, because I had a friend who works in I have a friend who runs a chain of pubs and has a transgender person wearing a binder, and kind of called me going, look, they're really scruffy, have you got any advice, because this person is wearing an oversized work shirt basically to try and mask the binder. And so we talked about several things, but in the end, making sure that there are options within your dress code. So for example, if someone is wearing a binder and a shirt, and that shirt they feel is revealing the binder, can you give the option of having something like a waistcoat over the top of it? It sounds ridiculous, and this was in the context of a pub that I was talking, so it was slightly less ridiculous there. But kind of thinking of what the problem is, and doing that in conjunction with potentially transgender people. I don't necessarily mean putting someone at your work on the spot. There's a lot of trans people out there who've had a lot of thoughts about this, but yeah, working with transgender people to get the idea of actually what are the problems they face with the uniform policy, and what are their thoughts potentially on your uniform policy, and what can you do to maybe mitigate some of these?
Definitely. And I mean, even with things like binders, I mean, I'm obviously not like an expert on this because I don't use one, but just from people I've asked and spoken to, obviously they can be quite uncomfortable, especially when worn for long periods of time. And so say a friend of mine would sometimes require like a break from it at times. So like throughout the day, would just want to like take it off, breathe for a bit, and then put it back on. Is there any way we could be doing that, like facilitating that in the workplace? Like could we maybe be like providing a room that's like a respite place that, someone can go and just take like half an hour, 10 minutes, whatever, and just decompress and then...
Yeah, absolutely. And like one way you could potentially tie this in with is again thinking of how we can have kind of inclusion activities that benefit multiple groups of people, is potentially considering having like a low sensory input room. So have a room which isn't for someone to go and work in on a laptop, isn't for someone to go and take a call in, but a room that is set aside with potentially lower lighting, keep it quiet, so that people who are neurodivergent can also go in and take a 10 or 15 minute break to kind of wind back down and kind of calm the sort of sensory inputs they're getting before going back out into work. So having a space like that the different groups of people can use and that meets the needs of different groups of people would be amazing if you could provide.
Definitely. I think that's a fantastic idea, is having that kind of sensory room. I know that a lot of places will use, say, like blue paper for printing as an aid for people who are dyslexic, or using sort of like brown as the font instead of black because it's less harsh, and that kind of thing. So we can be doing all those little things that can be adjusted that don't affect like the quality of what we're doing, but will improve the impact that it has on like the people that are doing it, and it has like an impact on so many people that it's always worth doing, and it's always worth asking what kind of things we could be doing.
I mean, another one that's related, for example, thinking in the same optic.
Absolutely.
Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about, well, now that we have largely online meetings, Zoom meetings, Teams meetings, things like this, making sure that your meetings are, say, 5 or 10 minutes short of the slot.
Yeah.
So if you have a 10 till 11 meeting, could you make that meeting 10 till 10:50, which means that people then have 5 or 10 minutes before presumably their next meeting. So if someone needs to take a binder break, then they can go and take their binder off and have 5 minutes and then go back into the next meeting. If someone just needs the toilet, they've got time to go and do that, or to grab a drink. So, that makes life much easier for anyone who potentially needs to use the toilet more often. So maybe that's pregnant women, maybe that's people with things like celiacs or something. And yeah, again, helps neurodivergent people who can then go and kind of decompress for 5-10 minutes. A lot of these interventions can help a huge range of different people.
Definitely. I think that's really important to note. These adjustments are so necessary and so important to so many different groups of people that it's so worth looking into and so worth making those adjustments. You mentioned pregnant people. Obviously, like a lot of workplaces have. Oh, wicked! I'm glad. Yeah, obviously, a lot of places have their policies on paternity, maternity, like pregnancy within the workplace, that kind of thing. And obviously, not everyone who gets pregnant is a woman. How can we be making sure that those policies are as neutral as possible? I know that, in a couple of months we've got there's breastfeeding awareness week and things like that, and I often sort of hear it sort of coined between breastfeeding and chest feeding, and trying to ensure that it's as inclusive as possible. So what can we be doing in the workplace to ensure that that is as neutral as possible?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, baseline one, which you sort of alluded to, is ensure that you're using sort of gender neutral language. A lot of people, so some companies, for example, instead of trying to have a maternity and paternity policy, are doing things like a primary carer policy, things like that. Again, this is not just helpful to trans people, where you may have non-binary people who are, or trans men who are pregnant, but also same-sex couples. For example, where I had a friend who worked in the NHS, whose wife was having a baby, and she ended up having, firstly, quite a long argument with HR about how she shouldn't have to be taking paternity leave, before HR basically said to her that, well, their policy was paternity leave or nothing, and so she grudgingly filed for paternity leave. But she's not the father.
Yeah.
So,
God.
So again, this is something that helps lots of groups. You can also, as well as using just neutral language, you can use language which is explicitly inclusive.
Yeah.
So in these policies, being explicitly clear that it applies to same-sex couples, for example, or that it applies to. I know there's a huge outcry at the moment about the war on women and erasing the word women, which pretty much no one's doing.
Yeah.
But if you're worried about that, you can so if you're worried about using pregnant people in case that's erasing women, you can use both. You can use women and other pregnant people.
I know. It's almost like using the word people doesn't erase the word woman.
Indeed. So yeah, just trying to looking at your policies and kind of making sure that they explicitly include other group, like wide groups of people. Now, breastfeeding, chest feeding, again, you may want to use both words. That one's probably less obvious than the sort of pregnant people, pregnant women dichotomy. And certainly the language that trans people use to refer to their bodies is just hugely variable. And to be honest, you're probably not going to make everyone happy.
Yeah.
And so just trying to ensure that it's as inclusive as possible is a good approach.
Definitely. I think that is one really important thing for everyone to take away, is that, you're not going to be able to do one blanket thing that fits everyone, because everyone is different, obviously. And so, I think that's quite often where people tend to fall at the last hurdle, is trying to please everyone sometimes pleases no one. And just doing your best to be as inclusive as possible, and then but having that leeway to be flexible and make adjustments for individual cases, because everyone's going to need different things or want different things or use different language and things like that. But it's just asking and just
Sorry, just think. I'm literally thinking as we're talking.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're talking about breastfeeding policies, if you could turn that on its head a bit and make it a baby feeding policy.
Yeah.
So take the emphasis off the way that the baby is being fed,
Yeah.
and put it just on the fact that is what we're doing. We're trying to feed the baby, and that's potentially more relevant for, depending on what the policy is encompassing. That's potentially also more relevant for adoptive parents or for parents who are just bottle fed. So I was about to say parents who are having to use formula or having to for whatever reason, a whole range of reasons.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, just reframing things and seeing where things can be turned around.
I think that would be a really fantastic idea if we sort of like started using things like baby feeding, because there's also a lot of shame and stigma attached to people who maybe choose not to breastfeed or can't breastfeed or choose to formula feed and that kind of thing, and that would kind of take away from that, because we're trying to come away from that kind of language. That's fantastic. Yeah, I really like that idea actually. But yes, amazing. Cool. So I'm just being mindful of time. We've got like 10 minutes left. I want to open up to see if there's some questions in the chat and see what we can, answer. So if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to pop them in, or if you want to just unmute yourself and, ask them out loud, please also feel free to do so. But we have one in here from Caroline. Does Kim have any tips on allyship and how to encourage leaders to be better allies?
So I mean, I heard a great thing. I can't remember who said it now, unfortunately, which is terrible. But on one of these sort of panels recently, I saw a great thing where someone was talking about how being an ally is a thing that you do, not a thing that you are. So I think that's an important point to make, is that you have to take actions in order to of allyship, rather than just being able to kind of declare, oh yes, I'm an ally.
Definitely.
So yeah, doing things like challenging your company's policies and taking those reviews and considering the recruitment strategy and trying to make those changes. That is how someone can be a better ally, is by taking those actions and making those changes. And where you have trans people who are present, then talk to them and see how you can elevate their voices, like where they want you to step up and where they want to lead. Because, as we said, all trans people are different. Lucy said in the chat that they might not want to be, the trans person in your company may not want to be a rep for all trans people, and shouldn't be forced into that position, which can often happen for people from minorities, is that they are default assumed to be the rep, which
definitely, yeah,
they may have no interest in.
Absolutely.
In terms of how to encourage leaders, I find a lot of it is down to kind of education. So whether you can put things in place like reverse mentoring is something that's being advocated a lot, which again, for a whole range of kind of minority voices, and not necessarily just minority voices strictly, but things like younger people in your company, having these kind of, making these reverse mentoring relationships where you kind of pair someone, where you pair senior leadership with people from a different background, a different perspective, and help to do that kind of education on perspectives that way. And in an ideal world, both of them get something from that relationship.
Yeah.
Things like engaging senior leaderships in kind of training where you can, encourage them into training, encourage them to attend these kind of panels when they are live. I know it can be difficult because senior leadership tends to have really limited time. But yeah, just trying to, the best way to kind of get them invested and to get them engaged is to find how much time they kind of have and how you are able to get some of that time to help raise their awareness so that it becomes an issue that they care about, because it becomes an issue that they know about.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is, a really good way to go about it. I think, like you said in the beginning of that, the allyship is, is always about taking the lead from the person and from that group. And, it's never assuming that the person from that group is going to be the spokesperson, especially like a lot of the time, a lot of this work can be very emotionally labored and like very draining. And that's something that especially people from minority groups deal with already. So, asking them for additional emotional labor is not something that, unless you're going to be compensating them for that really we should be doing. It is definitely an important thing to be considering. Let me just open the chat here. So we have a question here. Do you have any advice or like suggested comebacks for when someone is told that their ideas are too woke or progressive? This person works in quite like a traditional, like old school traditional industry, and sort of keeps getting called a bit of a snowflake colleague, and wants to sort of, is wondering what kind of advice would you give to someone who's being told that?
I mean, my first instinct is to find a better job with better colleagues.
Yeah.
I appreciate that's not always an option.
Of course.
However, that doesn't sound like a great environment. That sounds quite toxic, especially if people are saying that's too progressive, then that's absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
I think often one of the things you can do is look within the industry. So outside of your company, but other companies within the industry. My experience is in the tech industry, and there are at least 3 LGBT tech networks that are sort of cross company. So if you can try to find these for your industry, they almost certainly exist. If you're not thinking LGBT, it almost certainly exists for whichever sort of demographic you're thinking of. And these will be places that people are kind of sharing ideas, sharing best practice, and crucially, it allows you to kind of go, well, our competitors are doing this, which it sucks that that's how you have to motivate sometimes, but sometimes that is what you have to do. Is if you point out that your clients or your customers are starting to expect or starting to ask or starting to do something, if it's something that your competitors are doing maybe, but you're not. And having to find basically, while it would be lovely that they just bought into the moral case, sometimes you have to find those business levers where you can kind of go, well, other people are doing it, we're getting left behind.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's fantastic advice. I think a lot of the time people who are just really reactive and like defensive with these kinds of topics, I tend to just sort of, it's not necessarily like kill them with kindness, it's kill them with logic. It's almost like here's what's happening, here are the facts of what's happening. You're just a bit behind, or you're not getting it, like that kind of thing. And it tends to
it can also, I mean, in these looking externally, it can also be worth looking at obviously there's regularly surveys of social attitudes and identities and things of Absolutely. University students, for example, of young people of generation whichever the next one's coming along is, I've forgotten in a half second, Generation Z. And what all of these show are that, Generation Z is more queer and more woke and more progressive. So if your industry doesn't want to die, they need to be recruiting young people. And if you want to recruit young people, then you need to show that you have similar values to them. So again, that's another kind of business awareness lever that you could potentially push is, hey, these are the people that we need to recruit. So we need to do things so they want to work here.
Definitely. Yeah, that all massively links to that recruitment part. Okay, let me just check the time. Cool. We've got one about the use of staff facilities and changing rooms.
So I guess, I'm going to take a quick step back here. Obviously, trans people in changing rooms, incredibly hot topic at the moment. Yeah. Ridiculously hot topic, really, considering the number of trans people that are actually out there. So it's one of these annoying, frustrating ones that everyone's talking about, which is actually just so blown up. However, what about use of staff facilities, changing rooms? If you can provide an option for an inclusive toilet, that would be amazing, because then people have the option to use it. But that's the really key thing. You don't want to be providing it in such a way that this becomes the trans person toilet, and that if you are trans, you have to use that toilet. For one thing, you're back into the position of kind of outing someone. For another thing, if you have multiple buildings and only one of them has the space to convert a gender neutral toilet, is that trans person not allowed to use the toilet in other buildings?
Yeah.
I guess a sort of fundamental point here is that generally most trans people do not want to go and upset everyone, because frankly, that puts us into danger. So this kind of issue of, well, what about if they're making other people really uncomfortable? They probably don't want to be. So give them a way of not doing that, and allow them to judge when it's going to be kind of safe for them to go into the toilet matching their gender identity.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean,
I completely agree.
For me personally, for example, I've been on testosterone for 2.5 years. We have a gender inclusive toilet, so I use that. Perfect. We are in a building. We're in a shared building with other companies. There is no gender neutral changing room. Sometimes I go for a run at work, and this causes a problem. Where do I shower? There's no private showers either. So I mean, last week I went running with some male colleagues who I've known for years. I've known them before I transitioned. As a result, I kind of feel uncomfortable going into the men's with them, so I don't want to make them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So I went into the female changing rooms. 2 women from other companies came in and left. Like, nobody wins in these circumstances. So
yeah, definitely.
It's,
I think
it's a webinar, sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
I think that may have been Teresa wasn't on mute.
Oh, okay.
I'm so sorry, someone barged in, sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
And yeah, as Jamie's highlighted, unfortunately, yeah, there can be a backlash in certain newspapers. But to be honest, certain newspapers are going to backlash you whatever you do, especially if you do anything that might, help smaller groups. So
Definitely. I completely agree. I think the toilet situation is I'm not sure why it's a thing that's still being, that is a problem. Everyone just wants to pee, like it's not a big deal. Honestly, it's ridiculous. But I do think that the gender neutral toilet thing is a really good one to have. But I think, for me personally, I think that all toilets should be gender neutral, because why are we separating them out? I think when I go into, I've been into a men's toilet because I just couldn't hold it, and why would you want to pee in front of people? There's urinals and there's no privacy. Why would we not just have one big room with only cubicles? The workspace, we use a co-working space at THI, and when we go in there, it's like one toilet space, and it's all private cubicles, and anyone can go in there, and there's private showers and everything, and it's fantastic. I would not ever want to experience having to pee out in the open in front of people. I don't know why. Why is that a thing? Gender neutral toilets for the win. That should just be the blanket.
I guess I'll allow that a lot of buildings are hard to convert to standalone cubicles if they already have shared ones. So obviously, if you are in the position that you are planning a new building, 100%.
Absolutely, yes. But yes, amazing. Cool. All right, everyone. We are at the end of this now, I think, if we want to wrap up. Kim, is there anything that we should be checking out that you're doing? Anything you want to let us know about?
No, I guess the big one is Trans in the City, which is, in a nutshell, we're a I've forgotten exactly what it's called, but some form of not-for-profit organisation that is formed with the idea of trying to improve links between business and trans people and increase the accessibility of business to trans people. In the city, because we started in the City of London, it has spread now and is at the very least national, but is also got some international partners. If you would be interested in potentially partnering with us in that, please reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. At least one of you already has, I think. Stick my link into the chat there. So yeah, if you want to get in touch with me about that or about anything else, please feel free.
Perfection. Amazing. Thank you so much, Kim. This was a fantastic session. Everyone here today, anyone who's registered will get sent the recording of this anyway, and make sure you check it out, and we'll be sending around our ABCs of LGBTQ+ glossary as well. But yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining. And massive thanks to Kim.
Thanks everyone for your time.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.